Shamra. Shamra is an archaeological dig in Ugarit, the ancient city of Ugarit. Where is Ugarit? Ugarit is today's Latakia in Syria. We've heard of Latakia in the Syrian civil war, where the Russians is building a port there. So that's where it's at. In the spring of 1928, a Syrian farmer discovered a slab of stone in his field. He was digging and suddenly hit something, and upon extracting it from the soil, he discovered an underground vault containing jugs, tablets, gold, silver, and pieces of ivory. So this led to a French archaeological expedition directed by a F. Schaefer to the unearthing of Ras Shamra. In his diggings, Professor Schaefer was able to distinguish 5 levels of occupation at Ugarit. The most significant was the uncovering of a scribal school and library adjoining a temple. Most of the tablets were written in a strange new script. This strange script was discovered to be Ugaritic. While Ugarit was not a Canaanite city, the temple worship was Canaanite. Though there are some similarities in the sacrifices offered in the Canaanite system to that of the Israelites, the former, that means the Canaanite practice, was highly polytheist, extremely sensuous, and not infrequently violent. In the temples of the Canaanites, there were male and female prostitutes, sacred men and women, and all sorts of sexual excesses were practiced. It was believed that in some way, these rites caused the crops and herds to prosper. Also, we know that child sacrifice was occasionally practiced. Funerary jars have been found with bodies of young children distorted by suffocation as they struggled for life after having been buried alive as a sacrifice to Canaanite gods. In the religion of the Israelites, there is, as in comparison with the Canaanite religion, there's one God, whereas in Canaanite religion, there are many gods. There is no image of the God. It's a completely just and moral God. No human sacrifice, no temple prostitution. Israelites are called to be unique, unlike the Canaanites. They're called to be set apart in a covenant relationship with their God. So the first thing was when they came across the Canaanites, when they arrived at the Promised Land and the land of Canaan, they encountered with a people whose practice was totally different. And they're called to be set apart for this God, Elohim God, and not the El. El is just a generic name for God. So I think every culture calls their God the same thing, just as we call God or God spelled with a capital G or a small g. That's God, that's El. But the Jewish God has a special name. His name is Yud-He-Vah-He, or Yahweh, or Elohim, as distinguished from just El. The El just means a deity, a God, and they're called to be different. So, very often we hear the expression that Judaism has pagan roots. No, it does not. God took them from that culture, Canaanite culture, and steer it in a different way. So there are similarities because they share the same Mesopotamia area, they share the same kind of culture, but to say that it took things from the pagans, it's incorrect. totally incorrect. We have to revise the narrative.
Literature, which I will explain. The city of Ugarit is a city that was situated on the shores of the Mediterranean in northern Syria. It flourished and existed until about 1200 BC, when it fell as a victim of one of the battles of the Trojan War. And the Greeks who attacked Troy also attacked Ugarit. And now we have found letters written by the king of Ugarit, which refers to the battles that were taking place, and some of the letters actually say, our cities are burned and being consumed by fire as the enemy approaches. And he mentions the name of one of the Greek states that was fighting in the Trojan War. So we know the history of Ugarit. Now, Ugarit fell and was buried until about 1930, when it was discovered. When they discovered Ugarit, they discovered the writings of the Ugaritic people in two sets of writings. The first set of writings they discovered were the poetic mythology, that is, the religious literature. The other set of writings they discovered were diplomatic correspondence, letters sent. So from these two sets of writings, we get a very interesting picture of the civilization of Ugarit, which was a very highly developed city of the Canaanite Confederation, all of these cities along the coast that were dominated by the Canaanites, who are the Phoenicians, of which Tyre was the dominant city for many centuries. Now, in these Ugaritic texts, which were written in a language which is very similar to Biblical Hebrew, similar but older. So if the Ugaritic language is, let's say, 1500 BC, and the biblical language is 1200 BC, the distance between them in time is a few centuries. And I would say that Ugaritic is to Biblical Hebrew something like Shakespeare is to modern English. Same language and yet different. In fact, so different that there are many words that we don't quite understand and have different meanings. But that's the nature of a language over the course of 400 or 500 years. In the case of Ugarit, we have an older version of the language which we know as Biblical Hebrew. Phoenician of the 11th century and the 10th century BC is the same as Biblical Hebrew. Phoenician of the Roman period is quite different from Biblical Hebrew. Still the same language, but already different. And we have inscriptions in the Phoenician language dating from the Roman period. Now, in the legends of Ugarit, in these mythological poetry, there are many passages which are almost identical. Not the language, of course. The Greek and Ugaritic are quite different. But the ideas of Phoenician mythology coincide with the ideas of Greek mythology. They both have the same pagan approach to the problems of mythology. Now, one of the interesting points they make is that God, and the word for the father of the gods in Ugaritic is the same as the word for God in the Bible. It is El. El is the father of the gods in Phoenician, in Ugaritic. Baal is the god who is the son of El, but the Lord of heaven, meaning rain, thunder, lightning, all the booming stuff that comes from above. So it is Baal who brings the rain down or sends the rain down. Therefore, he is called the one who fertilizes the earth or puts life into it by his watering of the earth. And therefore, he is called Baal in the sense of husband of the earth. You see how all these things are brought together. Because the word Baal in Biblical Hebrew means master, boss, husband. But the same name in Phoenician means all of these things plus the god of thunder, lightning, and heaven. So you have these figures, and El is the father of the gods. Now, El is described as sitting on a throne from under whose foundation all the great waters of the earth flow out. So he is called the father who sits on the fountains of the great deep, and the water flows out from them. Now, I'm bringing this in as one of the elements of the portrayal of what the Garden of Eden is.
Study of the Shamra text has thrown a floodlight on numerous passages of the Old Testament scripture. There are many strange passages. We don't know where they come from, but studying of the Shamra text shows that it came from here. For example, scholars have been puzzled by the Mosaic prohibition, "Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk." Adam Clark, one of the scholars, felt that the design of the commandment was basically to prevent blunting moral sensitivity and developing hardness of heart. It is now known, however, that boiling a kid in milk to appease certain deities was a common Canaanite ritual. A Ugaritic text says, "Over the fire 7 times the sacrificers cook a kid in milk." Here also in Deuteronomy 23:17, a Mosaic prohibition, there shall no prostitute of the daughters of Israel, neither shall there be a sodomite of the sons of Israel. Thou shalt not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of Jehovah thy God for any vow, for even both these are abomination unto Jehovah thy God. So it is common in Canaanite practice, sacred prostitution, male and female prostitutes in the temple, so that you can have both sex with a female prostitute, you can have a sodomite, it does say here in Deuteronomy, activity with a male prostitute in the temple, and that's where that comes from, that Mosaic prohibition. And the other thing is Elijah. When Elijah was faced with Jezebel's group of prophets, it was like 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, where they say, okay, let's prove whose God is the real God. So Elijah said, we have 2 altars. You have yours, I have mine. We shall call upon both our gods to come down and burn up the sacrifice. And if your God is real, he will hear you. If my God is real, he will hear me too. And they were praying, both Baal, the worshippers of Baal, and Elijah were praying for fire to come down. And Baal, we know Baal is the god of thunder and lightning, the god of rain. So it would not be unforeseeable that he would come down and burn the sacrifices, but it did not happen. So Elijah taunted them and said, maybe you should cut yourself up some more, so that he will hear. He's not hearing you because you're not fervent enough. So they start cutting themselves up and bleeding and pleading, but nothing happened. But when Elijah prayed, God from heaven came down and burned up the sacrifices, thus showing that he is the real God. And the Shamra text, one can read all of it. I think there are like a few thousand pieces of it. And it demonstrate to us what we read in the Bible of Canaanite practice. And the whole idea is for God said, you shall not be like them.